friends. With you this Labor Day weekend. Grateful you have chosen to join with us this morning. And if you have a copy of God's Word with you, I'd invite you to turn with me to Psalm 13. We're going to take a short break this week from our look at 1 Corinthians with the holiday. And we're gonna look at Psalm 13 this morning. As you're turning there, you probably wouldn't be surprised to hear that depression rates in the United States are skyrocketing, particularly among young adults and women. That's information that was provided by Gallup in a poll that they published last year. And with that poll, they noted that depression rates are higher than they've ever been in terms of their own recording of that statistic. And so as long as Gallup has been recording that statistic, this is sort of the highest rates of depressions they've ever seen. And in some sense, I say we're not surprised by that because we probably all sort of intuitively know that. Like we know, right? Experience tells us that this is the case. All we have to do is look around and look at the state of our country and talk to our friends and family. We know that people are obviously hurting. And yet I think while that's clear, while we are a people who are hurting more and more, and people who are given over to despair, I think at the same time, sadly, it seems like we're sort of less and less equipped with knowing how to deal with that despair. So Dr. Megan Shin, who's an associate professor at Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center, and she's a grief expert, and she's noted that grieving in America is extremely difficult. For one, she notes that our culture just simply doesn't allow the time or the space for grief. We move at such a fast pace that we just don't really have time or space to allow folks to grieve properly, and that makes such statistics that we just saw very, very understandable. But then more than that, she notes that as much as we're sort of struggling, we're also a culture that's essentially in denial about our grief. We are obsessed with sort of positive thinking. We're desperate to convince ourselves and other people that we're fine, right? How are you doing? I'm great. But we know many times that's a superficial answer. And so it's sort of just expected that we want to avoid any discussion of grief or sadness or death or difficulty. It's just not something you do, right? It's not polite. And so that's not just true, I think, of our culture in general. It's also sadly true, I think, of sort of Christian subculture in the church. And I think that's particularly surprising. So you turn on the local Christian radio station, and what kind of music are you likely to hear? Well, you're going to hear sort of positive, encouraging, uplifting music. One pastor, Mark Vergrop, puts it this way: when I tune into my radio to the local Christian station, this is the theme that I hear over and over again. It's not just the station's motto. The music is upbeat. The hosts are jovial. There's plenty of laughter. The only downer is the news, but then they get straight back to the regular programming. And then Vergrop goes on to say, unfortunately, most church services are like this. You step into the majority of Sunday worship gatherings, you're most likely to be fed a steady diet of triumphalistic songs, hope-filled lyrics, high-energy musicians, and popular sermons are engaging and peppered with a funny story or two. Positive and encouraging is the new liturgy. I think his point is not that there's no place for those things in the Christian life, right? Obviously there is. But Vergrop's point is in part that there's something missing. There's something missing in all of that. And what is it? Well, it's the song of lament, the music of grief. And so in his book, Dark Clouds, Deep Mercy, Vergrop argues that lament is a kind of missing grace, a grace that's missing from much of our experience as evangelicals. And we might be surprised, actually, to learn that the Bible is quite full of lament. In fact, the Psalms in particular are full of lament. Over 1/3 of the Psalms are psalms of lament, psalms played in that kind of minor key of life. And these are songs that God has given us to help us know what to do with our grief, what to do with our sorrow. Something, again, we perhaps need now, I think, more than ever. And I think one of the best examples of this is our text this morning, is Psalm 13. This is a wonderful psalm that gives sort of a clear example of the grace of God that is held out to us in lament. And so I want us to read this together, and then we'll think about what this means. Starting there, Psalm 13, verse 1. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I take counsel in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all the day? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? Consider and answer me, O Lord my God. Light up my eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death, lest my enemy say, I have prevailed over him, lest my foes rejoice because I am shaken. But I have trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. So like I mentioned, this is a psalm of lament. And it's a lament specifically written by King David. We see that at the kind of superscript there at the top of verse 1, to the choir master, a psalm of David. And yes, that's the same David who slew Goliath. And so maybe the picture we have of David, right, is that picture of a mighty warrior, a king. And so we may read a psalm like this and we may be surprised to hear such painful and vulnerable words from a warrior, a king. We don't know the exact circumstances behind this psalm, what sort of moment in life this was for David when he wrote it. We do know that though David was a king, though he was a mighty warrior, he wasn't free from difficulty and despair. In fact, I think if you look at David's life in Scripture, he had a very tumultuous life. And that wasn't just sort of when it came to conflicts that he had as a king and a warrior, but he faced a surprising amount of pain in his own relationships, in his personal life. Right? So what do we know of David? Well, we know he grew up as that sort of overlooked, isolated younger brother out in the field, shepherding his father's flocks on his own, sort of having to fend for himself. Even when he was anointed finally as king by God, he found himself on the run from Saul, a mad king who was determined to kill David. Despite the fact that David loved Saul, he was loyal to him. And then later, David found himself betrayed, again on the run, but this time from his own son, Absalom. A son David himself failed in numerous ways as a father. A conflict that eventually led to Absalom's death and even more grief and pain for David. And then you add to that moments of despair in his own life brought on by seasons of personal darkness and failure, like the death of another child and his sin with Bathsheba. And all of that, it's clear from the picture that we have of David that he had a difficult life, a life that was continually marked by conflict and pain and suffering. And so the reality is, I think if we look at this psalm, like it could have been written at any moment, at any point in David's life. And we can tell from the Psalms that David writes, of which there are many, he was a man who, yes, he was a warrior, he was a king, but he also felt his emotions keenly and deeply. And he aimed to bring those feelings, though, under God's sovereign faithfulness. And that didn't just include his joy and his praise and his gratitude, but also his grief and his pain. And we see that here in this psalm. We look at David's situation here. It is miserable indeed, right? David's despair is overwhelming. Right? His defeat seems imminent. And yet, worst of all, God feels distant. That's where David is at in this moment. And so what does he do? What does he do with all of these dark feelings? Does he become bitter? Does he run from God? No. In fact, he draws near to God. He draws near to him in lament. Even though God feels distant, David clings ever closer to God. And he does this in three ways that I think are very important and instructive for us. And so in verses 1 and 2, we see David bringing a kind of holy protest before God as he pours out not just his pain, but his complaints before God in a deeply honest way. And then with that protest expressed in verses 3 and 4, David turns in faith to petition God for help, crying out for God to intervene, lest he die. And then finally, in verses 5 and 6, we have, having made these protests and these petitions known, we see something so important. David closes by moving forward in trust. He moves forward in confidence, a confidence that is rooted in God's goodness and character. And I think these three sort of movements of the psalm, they really teach us something very important about lament, about what it looks like to come to God in the midst of darkness and despair, and how we can bring these feelings to God and move forward with confidence. And it shows us what it looks like to draw near to God in lament. And that's the main thing that I want us to take away from this psalm this morning. When we're faced with our own sorrows and our own struggles, I pray that this psalm would teach us to depend on God amid our despair by drawing near to him in lament. And we're going to consider what this looks like as we dive into each of these three movements. Again, there are many lament psalms. I wanted us to look at this one in particular because I think it's just such a clear, helpful, short, brief, crisp model for what this looks like. And my hope is that we would be encouraged and instructed as we learn to depend on God in the same way that David is here. So let's dive in. And as I said, David's lament here, it begins with a kind of holy protest before God when it comes to his pain and his despair. This holy protest involves drawing near to God in his pain and making his complaints known to him. This means he's not just sort of being open and honest with God about his pain and his sorrow, but he's crying out in a way that expresses kind of a deep recognition that something is not right about this. This is not the way that David thinks things should be, not because David is looking at his circumstances through his own eyes, but because he knows God's own character and God's purposes. I think the idea here is not that David is sort of protesting God. It's that David is protesting his pain precisely because he knows who God is and what God wants. It's a way for him to say, God, I know you're good, but right now it is hard for me to see that. It is hard for me to see that because things don't seem to be the way that you would want them to be. And so this complaint, it takes the shape of sort of these deeply honest questions that are less about sort of seeking an answer to his pain and more about seeking God's presence in the midst of it. Right? It's one thing to walk through a season of difficulty and despair, but what makes all of this truly discouraging and disheartening for David is the fact that God seems so distant. That's where David begins. Right? The starting point for David in this lament is a deep acknowledgement that God feels totally distant. David feels both forgotten and forsaken by God. Look at the way he puts it in verse 1. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? Will you hide your face from me? Forgotten and forsaken, and for too long. Right? That's his protest. God, it feels like you've forgotten me. It feels like you've turned your face away from me. How long do I have to feel this way? That's his cry. And where are you? It feels like you have abandoned me. How much longer do I have to go on feeling this way? And I wonder if there's ever been times in your life when you have felt like the way David feels here, when it feels like God maybe has forgotten or forsaken you, like he's turned his gaze away from you. I know I have. Some of the darkest moments of my life have come not just from having hard circumstances, but ultimately from seasons where God felt distant and even absent. That's truly, truly, truly terrible, especially for those of us who long for him, who love him. I think an important question that we're often faced with in those moments, a question that jumps out to us even immediately here, is David right? Has God truly forgotten him? Has God truly forsaken him? Is he truly distant in these moments? I think David would agree, well, the answer, of course, is no. Of course, God hasn't forsaken him. Of course, God hasn't forgotten him. But that doesn't change the fact that that's precisely the way David feels. That's exactly what his perception is in this moment. It's not that God is distant, it's that God feels distant. That's the problem. And believe it or not, this is a common experience for many Christians, for many believers. Right? Many have noted seasons like this where God feels distant. The reality is, if we belong to him, God is never truly distant. He will never truly forsake us, but we do have to contend with the fact that it is a common experience for Christians to go through periods where they feel like God is distant. There are many kind of names for this experience. Some have called it the dark night of the soul, the winter time of the soul. The Puritans like to speak of it as the sort of experience of desertion. And they have, in particular, lots of really good resources on this experience. I think the reasons why we often go through these seasons and why God might cause us to feel this way, like, those are important things for us to consider. Here, though, I want us to simply acknowledge this is a real experience. And so if you've been there or if you know someone who's there, be careful not to jump to the conclusion like, well, clearly you're doing something wrong. Clearly you just need to stop feeling that way, right? That's not helpful. And the reality is, like, even someone like David can be in this place, can be in this position where God feels distant. The key question for us then is, what happens? What do we do about that? What does David do? Well, he acknowledges it, right? He's honest about it. He's honest not just with himself, but he's honest even with God. He expresses this directly to God himself, even in a way that is protesting this. Right? This isn't right. You shouldn't be distant. I don't want you to be distant. David longs for God's presence. He longs to be in God's presence. He acknowledges to God, I want this to be over. How much longer do I have to go on feeling like you are not here? In the same way, I think David is encouraging us to express our own protest to God, a protest not about God, but a protest that longs for God, that says to God, I don't want to feel you being absent anymore. Like, how long, God? But David's also honest about something else that's important, and something I think that we often miss, something we're, I think, even afraid to acknowledge at times. And that's his feelings of deep isolation. Look at the first part of verse 2. How long must I take counsel in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all the day? And what's David saying here? Well, he's not just protesting the fact that God feels far away, but he's protesting the fact that he feels isolated. That he's been forced, in essence, to turn to himself, to act as his own counselor, and he's tired of it. It's a terrible place to be in, right? He's a terrible counselor, especially in this season. He knows the state of his own heart. He knows how little help he can be to himself in this moment. And yet he feels as though he has been left to be his own counselor, he, the one who is filled with sorrow all day long. That's a dreadful position to be in, to feel forced to take counsel in your own soul, to kind of pull yourself up, encourage yourself up when you're struggling, when your own internal thoughts and feelings are part of the reason you're struggling in the first place. That's like going to see a counselor. You're like, I feel really bad, I'm depressed, I'm going to go see a counselor. And it turns out you get there, well, the counselor's actually more depressed than you are. And so all of his advice is just making things worse. Right? That's what it feels like to kind of be isolated in seasons of despair and sort of having to rely on who? Well, just yourself. And how can David heal himself when he is the one who is sick with grief? But that's where he finds himself. He feels isolated, left to solve his problems on his own, and he's tired of it. He knows, right? I am no counselor. I'm tired of listening to myself. Right? This is the flip side of feeling as though God is distant. Because God feels distant, David feels as though there's no one there but himself. He's been left to take counsel not from God, but in his own soul, that very soul that's wrapped up in sorrow. And that's where he is. And we're in seasons of despair and God feels distant, especially if others feel distant too. It is so easy to feel this way. So easy to feel isolated and left to ourselves. And I'm just talking about loneliness. I'm talking about a feeling of, okay, I've got this real problem and I'm looking around and I'm the only one here to try to help myself get out of this situation. How's that going to work? Because I'm the very problem that I'm trying to solve. That can be incredibly painful, not just because we feel lonely, but because we're ultimately feeling like we're trapped with ourselves as our own counselor. We have to wrestle through our own despair, our own hearts and minds, and yet it's us that's the problem. I'm not going to quote Taylor Swift. And so trying to reason your way out of despair and depression and bolster yourself up in those moments, it just doesn't work. Right? That's oftentimes what people will sort of encourage us to do, or what we think we have to do. I just have to muster the strength. I got to tell myself, don't be sad. You can do this. You can keep going. But friends, we're our own worst counselor, especially in those moments. But that's where David is. And so he makes that protest clear to God. This doesn't work, God. I don't want to be left to myself. I don't want to have to rely on myself. I need you. I don't want to be isolated anymore. I don't want to have to figure this out on my own. He longs for the day when he is no longer left to solve his problems on his own. He has God to be there for him. He protests then. How long, God, do I have to be my own counselor? And so in this way, I think David teaches us to cry out to God with our feelings of isolation. He teaches us to feel comfortable with being uncomfortable in those seasons of isolation. And that's important. We never want to get used to feeling isolated. God has made us to be people who exist in community with other people, right? With other believers, and ultimately with Him. So we don't want to live in isolation. And when we feel this way, we must cry out to God, and we must seek others out. We don't want to be in isolation. But it's not just internal despair, right? There are real problems here. Right? It's not just David's feelings, but there's actually something going on that's sort of prompting all of this, and David makes that clear here, and he protests it. Look at what he says. How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? Right? So David has real external problems that are causing his despair. He has a real enemy who's after him. We don't know who that is. David had many enemies. It's not the point. But in this moment, that enemy is not only sort of there and David feels it, but David recognizes he has the upper hand. He's exalted over me. I am not in the winning position here. And so David laments he's not just having to endure this enemy, but he is on the verge of defeat. Right? He is on the verge of defeat. And so he lies in despair with these feelings of defeat. Again, though, David isn't simply huffing and puffing about his problems. He's crying out to God. He's acknowledging his pain, and he's saying, God, in your absence and in my isolation, I'm about to be defeated. God, how long do I have to fight this battle on my own? Because I'm not winning it. I can't. When will I stop losing? I'm weary of it, God. In seasons of despair, it's important to acknowledge the things that are causing us pain. The real objective problems that contribute to our sorrow and to our despair. More than that, it's important to bring those things to God, right? Not just to try to problem solve, okay, how do I deal with all that? But acknowledging those things so that we can be honest with God about those things that are defeating us and causing us to despair. And so our enemies aren't likely to be like David's. We probably won't have a mad king trying to spear us to the wall or a son trying to take our throne. But there are going to be real external factors, real sources of trouble for us, right? That might be a person we love, a relationship that's difficult, illness, patterns of sin, tragedy. Right? The point is, oftentimes when we are walking in a haze of despair, we get so overwhelmed by our pain that we forget that there are actually real problems causing that despair in the first place. So we get lost in our feelings. We fail to acknowledge, actually, there's a reason why I feel this way. There's real problems here. And we want to acknowledge those problems, and we want to bring those problems before God, and we want to bring them in holy protest. God, how long will this sickness exalt over me? How long will this person treat me this way? How long will I continue to lose this battle with sin? How long will my grief over the loss of this loved one tread me down and have victory over me? It's okay to acknowledge the very real things that cause us despair. But we want to bring those to God. We want to make our protests and our pain in those things known to him. But if all we do is make complaints, right, that in and of itself we recognize wouldn't be good. And so these protests are a good starting place. But if that's all we do, right, that leaves us no better off than when we began. And so David moves from crying out in pain to crying out for help. That's the next step of lament, petitioning God for his help. And that's exactly what David is going to do there in verses 3 and 4. And how does he do that? Well, notice that most importantly, what is he seeking? Well, he's seeking God's attention. Consider and answer me, O Lord. If God's distance is the source of David's despair here, then what does David most deeply long for? God's attention, God's presence. This is a desperate plea for help, a desperate plea that acknowledges what David needs most, and what he longs for most in this moment is not first and foremost that God would deliver him from his enemies. We would think, having just read, how long, God, will this enemy exult over me? Will you deliver me from him? But that's not David's first request. David's request is that God would see him and hear him. What's important about David's questions previously and what David asked God for here is it reveals that David understands that God's presence is his deepest need in this moment. David has lamented the fact that God feels distance. That's how he started, and he doesn't want that to be the case. And so he draws near to God and he cries out, not in anger, but in hope that this season might soon end. And in the first sort of request that he brings to God is, put it to an end. Stop feeling distant. Stop forgetting me. Stop hiding your face from me. Consider me, hear me, answer me. That's the deep longing that these honest expressions of pain reveal. And it's good to be honest about our depression. It's good to be honest about our despair. But if that honesty can take different forms, it can lead in different directions. And so we can be honest about the way we feel in a way that kind of leads us to maybe be more angry and more bitter. And if that's the case, we're likely to do the opposite of what David does here. And so if our depression is leading us down that sort of road of angerness and bitterness, it's unlikely that we'll want to run to God and ask God to be present. In fact, probably what we'll do is we will find ourselves struggling to draw near to God at best, and then at worst, maybe we might even find ourselves cursing God. If that's the case, that may be a sign that our despair and God's distance is leading us in the wrong direction. But if that pain leads us to want to draw even closer to God, to want to cry out in longing that God would help us by drawing near to us, well, that's a healthy starting place. It's the kind of honesty that will lead us eventually to have hope and not hopelessness, as we're going to see. And so that's a simple question. Like, when you feel this way, is this what you're longing for? Do you long for God's presence? Do you plead for him to make himself known to you? Do you plead for God to see and to hear you? God's presence and our experience of it is the difference maker in seasons of difficulty. He could ask for God to fix the problem. Sometimes he does. What's remarkable in some senses in this psalm is that he never does that. Because David knows ultimately the difference maker is God's presence. I mean, what does he say in Psalm 23? Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Why? For you are with me. So David knows, I can walk through darkness. You don't have to take the darkness away, God. I just need to know that you are there. I need your presence, God. That's why David is crying out here and pleading for God to do this. That's enough. Is it enough for us? Is it enough for God to make his presence known to us in those seasons of darkness? Are we able to say, God, I don't need you to remove this. I don't even need to not feel this, but I need you. I can't do this unless you're here. And if you are here, then that's all I need. That's all I want in this season is your presence. Don't be distant. Consider me and answer me. And so in keeping with this, David asked not just for God to show up, but he asked God to act. with a simple but important request. Light up my eyes. Light up my eyes. Well, what is David asking for? Well, I think there are two ways of sort of parsing that out. Like, in one sense, I think he's either asking God for perspective or for joy. I mean, for what it's worth, like, I think it's kind of both. In some sense, like, we can't really separate those two things. We can acknowledge that these things go hand in hand. I mean, it could be that David is saying, God, I need you to help me see this situation differently. Give me sort of an enlightened perspective on my problems and my suffering. Help me to get out of my own self, to stop being my own counselor and to see things the way you see them. And if you do, then maybe he understands, like, then I won't be trapped in this despair. If that's so, then it's important because it shows David knows, in some sense, like he's a prisoner to his own isolated perspective in this moment, which is often the case when we're in sort of seasons of depression and despair. And we can't get out of seeing things the way we see them. But I think in the same vein, it may be that David is also acknowledging that he needs, and he is asking for God not just to draw near, but to draw near in such a way that he's lifted up out of his despair and his eyes are no longer dim but bright. That he's no longer discouraged and defeated, but he's encouraged because God is near again. That there's real joy in his eyes again. Again, for what it's worth, like, I don't really think we separate these two things. Like, God's presence brings both. It brings both a change in our perspective for our despair, and it brings real encouragement in the midst of sorrow. But it may not remove it, but it does change the way we see it, and it helps us to be encouraged in the midst of it. It lifts us from our own sort of weakened view and our own weakened frame, and it gives us eyes to see things, eyes that see light instead of that darkness that we're used to seeing. Eyes that are encouraged and brightened and lifted up by God's presence. When all you see is darkness, friends, plead with God. Plead with him to draw near and to light up your eyes. Plead with him to change your perspective and to fill your vision with light and with life. David does something else, though. He pleads for God's attention and for him to act, but he does all of this acknowledging his complete dependence on God. If God doesn't do this, right, this isn't just sort of a secondary option for David, like, okay, I'll ask God first, and then if that doesn't work, I'll try to figure this out. David acknowledges, if you don't do this, I'm done. I'm sunk. Light up my eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death, lest my enemies say, I have prevailed over him, lest my foes rejoice because I'm shaken. And in fact, David's saying, God, you have to answer me because the alternative is my death and my destruction. If you don't intervene, I'm done. I don't have any other, there's nothing here I can do. If you don't intervene, I'm done for. And in the picture here, it's really grim. It's not just that he'll be defeated, but that his enemies will stand over him, gloating over him in defeat, like, this guy's pathetic. And so in some sense, God's loyalty to David is on the line as the king. David acknowledges, though, that if God doesn't show up, he's doomed. And I think what's interesting with that is that David sees a deep connection here between his discouragement and his defeat and his encouragement and his salvation. Again, he doesn't ask God, God, show up and zap my enemies. Though there are places where he'll do that. He just asks God simply to show up, light up my eyes. And if you'll do that, then I won't be defeated. Then I won't be dead. And so for David, that's the difference maker. The difference between his defeat and his salvation comes not from being delivered from his circumstances, but again, from being sustained by God's presence. It all hinges on his own heart before God, God's own presence with him. And David acknowledges that despair in that sense is really the real enemy here. It's the enemy that will ultimately allow the other enemies to take him down. But at the same time, his dependence on God means that God's encouraging presence is enough. It's enough to deliver him in this moment. And there's a real sense of desperation here, one that God's people must have as we cry out to God for help. God shouldn't be our last resort. He should be our deepest source of good. We need to be able to bring our needs before him with a deep sense of our dependence on him, that if he doesn't act, we've got nothing. And this may be hard to hear, but I suspect that this is one of the major reasons why God allows us to go through such seasons. Because I think it's His way and His wisdom to teach us just how much we need His presence, just how vital it is to our lives as His people. I suspect God allows us to feel at times His absence so that we might feel the terror of despair that comes from being apart from Him, so that we may be reminded just how much we need Him. That kind of dependence, it fuels us to cry out and to seek Him as the only true and real solution to our pain and our problems. It reminds us, without Him, I'm sunk. But there's one key part of lament, one last part of what it means to draw near to God with our laments. And we need to protest, we need to petition for help, but having done that, we bring our lament sort of fully forward in faith, ultimately by trusting in God's goodness. And that's really the kind of key thing that sets lament apart from any other kind of complaint or any other sort of way that we might approach God. This is really the difference maker for lament. If we walk away without having moved to this place of trust, we've kind of failed to move lament forward in faith. And David does that in two important ways here. He expresses a present trust in God and then a future hope in God, both of which are rooted in God and His goodness. Notice how he does this. Look at verse 5. But I have trusted in your steadfast love. What's I think worth noting here is David's just made his request, right? It's not as though he wrote this down, walked away, came back next year and said, hey, everything worked out? Let me write about how good this is. The situation's not been resolved. And the likelihood that David now just feels remarkably different, like it's just probably not the case. But he doesn't wait for God to act. He doesn't wait until he feels differently. He has made his protest known. He's made his petition known. And so what does he do? He knows now he must resolve to trust. He must resolve to say, look, the mere act of lamenting itself, the fact that I've brought these to God, I've made my request known to him, and even if I don't feel like he's near, I trust that he hears me. I trust that he's going to act. And I love the way that he frames this. Like it's a done deal already. Like I've already trusted. I have trusted in your steadfast love by crying out to you, by making this request known. And so I'm not going to fear my death. I'm not going to fear my destruction. I'm not going to fear my despair, even though for David, I think all those things are still very much present. But he moves forward in hope and trust, knowing that God's steadfast love gives him confidence. It's the anchor that David clings to here. David is saying, I've trusted the fact that you're good. Right? I may not feel it, but I know that that's what it is. Right? That's what it means for God to have steadfast love. David's in fact saying, I know you're not only a loving God, but you are a God who loves steadfastly, a God whose love never changes. So regardless of how I feel right now, that's what I'm going to root myself in. I'm going to be confident that you love me, even though I don't feel like it. I'm going to be confident that you hear me and that you're going to act. I trust you. I trust I will not succumb to despair, that my enemies will not defeat me, because you don't change. And your steadfast love doesn't change whether I feel that or not. I change, my feelings change, but God, you don't change. And I know that's who you are. That's in effect what David is saying. And this is the key in lament to moving forward in faith when we're struggling. Like, if we're honest, we're often comfortable with kind of the first two parts of lament. Hey, sure, I'll protest, I'll make requests. But oftentimes we want to wait. Like when we do that, like I'm going to make my protest known, I'm going to make my request known, and then I'm just going to kind of wallow in that pain until something feels different. And then we think maybe I just have to sort of be stuck in this perpetual cycle of pain and protest and prayer until all of a sudden God shows up and acts and then everything's better. But I think if we operate that way, we're missing the importance of this last step of lament. And it's not important because it's sort of the key to solve the problem. It's not as though, like, if we don't do this, God doesn't show up. It's not important because by doing this, we then somehow do solve the problem. We do take away our pain. It's important because it's the difference of whether or not we're going to move forward trusting God or not. For David, trusting God in lament means just that. It means trusting him, even as he waits for God to act, even as he feels exactly the same. And this is the part of lament that allows us, too, to move forward. It's really the key to actually being able to put one foot in front of the other and continue on, even when we continue to feel the weight of our suffering and our trials. Like, we don't have to muster the strength to carry on, to get out of bed, and to keep going every day. We can do that because we have confidence ultimately in God himself. That regardless of what we feel, God hasn't changed. His promises haven't changed. His purposes haven't changed. Who he is will never change. And whether we feel that or not, we can anchor ourselves in that truth. And that's how we move forward. Confidence that God himself is who he says he is. And this is the part of lament that ultimately reveals whether or not we really believe God is who he says he is. Right? Whether or not we really believe that he is who he has revealed himself to be. And so how do we do that? Well, we draw on God's past faithfulness towards us. Now, we opened with that call to worship, right? That we would recount the deeds of the Lord. That we would look back on our lives. That we would see the way that God has shown his goodness to us time and time again. As a way to say, I don't feel like you're here. I don't feel you're good right now. But I know I can look back and I know I can remember times where I did feel that way. And I know I can remember times where you were clearly good. And you haven't changed. Like I have, but you haven't. Well, we draw on his character. We remind ourselves of who we know him to be, who he has said he is. And we draw on his word. Not to be sort of read it, like maybe I'll just feel better because I read the Bible. No, we go to his word desperately seeking to be reminded of his faithfulness and his character and his promises and his purposes to say, these things haven't changed. But more than anything else, we draw on the gospel. Because the gospel itself, it's the ultimate proof of God's steadfast love towards us and his promise of salvation. It's a love and a salvation offered to sinners and sufferers like us. So we look at the passage that we read earlier in our scripture reading, Isaiah 53. We're reminded of that gospel for sinners and sufferers, right? We're reminded of the Son of God, that suffering servant who was made to lament so that we could be lifted up out of our sorrow. That one who was stricken and smitten and afflicted by God as he turned his face away from him, who actually felt the real rejection of God on our behalf. He was actually made to sleep the sleep of death, unlike David and unlike us, so that we would be raised up in life. He was defeated and shaken by his foes so that he might triumph over those great enemies of sin and death. Friends, recognize everything David fears and despairs in this psalm, Jesus endured. He suffered to redeem us from sin and suffering, to give us eternal hope and comfort. And there's a day coming in which that sin and all that sorrow will be wiped away because of him. So if you don't know Jesus, whatever despair you may have in your life, it's nothing compared to the despair of being truly forsaken and forgotten by God. But that's the good news of the gospel. Jesus suffered so that you might know God's presence, so that you might not be forgotten and forsaken, but reconciled to God. And because of Jesus, all those who turn and they put their trust in him can have this confidence that David has. Confidence that God, his steadfast love will be for them, that his salvation will be for them. And you might not realize this as someone who doesn't know God or doesn't follow Jesus, but David's prayer, it's actually deeply important for you because it's a model for you too of what it looks like for you to draw near to God, maybe not in your depression, but even just for the first time, to cry out for help And to say, because of what Jesus has done, I have confidence, God, that you will receive me, that you will not forsake me. You can have confidence that God will hear you and that he will save you, not because of anything you've done, but because of what Jesus has done. So whether it's the first time or the 100th time, friends, the gospel, it's the deepest assurance that we have, the deepest source of our ability to turn to God and trust in his goodness. So no matter how you feel, believer, no matter what's going on, you can always look back to the gospel and say, I know that God's steadfast love hasn't changed. I can trust him, even if I don't feel like this is good. And that's the present attitude of faith that David exercised. But I love how he ends, because it's not just sort of a focus on trusting God right now, but there's this clear sort of future focus. Notice the shift that David makes at the very end. He doesn't just have confidence in God in the present, he has confidence of God in the future. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. Okay, David's not saying, hey, everything's better now, I'm rejoicing. No. But he can say, I will. Like, that's coming. I know that will happen. That joy is coming. I will sing to the Lord. That's going to happen because he's dealt bountifully with me. And these are important declarations of faith. But what is faith as it looks forward but hope? That's what it means to have hope. David is saying to God, because I've trusted in you now, even if I'm struggling to rejoice in you now, I can rest assured that won't be the case forever. My heart will rejoice one day. I will no longer feel this despair. I will sing to you. I will sing not a song of lament anymore, but a song of joy. Because I'll be able to look back and say, you have dealt bountifully with me, God. You've been good to me. That's hope. Hope which we so often desperately need in moments of despair. But that's sort of hope. It's not just like pie in the sky idealism. It's not like, I just am just hoping things get better. Just hoping things are good tomorrow. Again, it's rock solid confidence in the future. Like, God will be good to me, even if I don't feel it right now, because that's who he is. I know it. I know I will sing again. It's confidence because I know God is who he says he is. He will be good to me. I will sing. And even if I'm struggling to feel the reality of that now, I can look past my present circumstances. I can look past everything I'm feeling. Like, it's all still there. But I can look past all of that and declare and trust, like, this is not going to last. Joy is coming. Salvation is coming. And again, why can we have that confidence? Why can we have that hope? Because of Christ. Do we see the beauty here in all of this? Do we see the beauty of where David's come from at the beginning of his prayer to where he ends? He moves from protest to praise. Right? When we're in the throes of despair, we need to learn this grace of lament. We must learn to bring our lament before God so that we can be brought to this place of confidence and hope. This is what it means to walk in faith in the midst of darkness and sorrow and pain. Faith in God doesn't make us sort of happy, clappy people who ignore our pain and pretend like everything's okay when it isn't. It's just not the way it works. And we know that that doesn't work. Yet that's sort of the expectation. What faith does do is it calls us to be honest with God about our pain, to protest it even, to make our requests known to him, but then to finally rest in hope that joy is coming even though it's not here right now. That's the grace of lament that God calls us to. Friends, may we learn to walk in that grace. Will you bow your heads with me? God, we acknowledge that in our pain, God, often we are prone to seek any answer we can, except for the answer that's so clear to us in your word. that is the answer, to turn to you and to wait on you. We're so desperate in our pain to solve that, to ignore it, to escape it, to cover it. God, help us to learn, God, though, just the glory and the beauty and the freedom of being able to lament before you. And I pray whatever we're experiencing, God, this week, whatever struggles we are wrestling with, God, whether that's small, God, or huge, God, teach us to see the place of lament in our lives this week, God. Help us to draw near to you. God, draw near to us. We need you, Father. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Friends, we'll stand and sing.